Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Well, today we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And before I start, hopefully the microphone issue has been rectified. If not, I am sure I will be notified in the comments section. But hopefully we are all squared away now, and the microphone is working properly. So, what is happening within the confines of the conflict, especially the southern area of where the fighting is taking place, south of Zaporizhia? So, remember just a couple of weeks ago, the Ukrainians were not so much focused on what was happening south of Zaporizhia, south of Orkiv, but a lot of the focus was near Bakhmut. Now, we have not seen or heard much discussion from the Ukrainians now about Bakhmut. Remember the salient that was created, the Ukrainians were talking about enveloping Bakhmut and then retaking Bakhmut. Well, the Russians have stopped that, essentially. The Ukrainians were able to make inroads in this area, but thus far they have not been able to move further to the east, cutting off this road that leads into the northern part of Bakhmut, and vice versa, the southern area too, this triple envelopment operation that the Ukrainians were looking to conduct. Now, heavy fighting is still taking place in this area, and at the same time, we are seeing new Russian initiatives within the area northeast of Seversk, where we have seen this buildup of Russian forces. Now, the Ukrainians now are talking about success along the southern front, the area south of Orkiv, south of Zaporizhia. And we want to have a look at this because we've heard a lot about the Ukrainians taking several towns, and the Ukrainians and a lot of content providers that are supporters of the Ukrainian military report that multiple Ukrainian towns have been retaken by the Ukrainians. Now, the problem with that is, are they towns? And is this putting the Ukrainians in a position for success? We know now that the Ukrainians are using a tactic in which they use very small unit operations with wheeled vehicles to very quickly move into an area. Then what we will see is a Ukrainian flag is hoisted over a certain building or structure, and then that area is declared retaken by the Ukrainians. Now, the problem with that is the Ukrainians very quickly get out of these areas, because these areas, which are just to the north of some of the main Russian defensive lines, and just south of those main defensive lines, is a lot of Russian artillery. So essentially, the Ukrainians are going into these towns, which ultimately are, and they're not towns, they're very small villages. If you can kind of see here on the map, again, very small settlements. These are not towns, these are not cities. These are essentially open fields where the Ukrainians are shooting down. They are not penetrating main Russian lines of resistance, which are further to the south. Okay, these areas here are areas where the Russians have overlapping artillery capability, meaning they are able to hit the Ukrainians that move into this area with mortar fire. They are able to hit the Ukrainians with 152 millimeter heavy artillery fire. They're able to hit the Ukrainians in this area with Grad, multiple launch rocket systems in this area. And then obviously, probably the most important component of some of the Russian defensive operations that we've seen recently is attack helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, are able to fly still behind Russian lines and attack these Ukrainian forces. So we think the Ukrainians are moving in very quickly, hoisting flags, declaring victory, and then skedaddling out of there, so to speak. They are not moving heavy forces. They are not using those columns of Bradleys and Leopard 2s and heavy forces to consolidate areas that they have taken. They're simply moving in, hoisting the flag, and then getting out. Because if the Ukrainians stay in these positions, they're just going to get shelled into oblivion. And therein lies the problem right now with the Ukrainian offensive and why it has stalled. The Ukrainians can't move south. If they move south with heavy forces designed to penetrate those Russian lines, they get engaged by Russian attack helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, heavy artillery, small units of Russian anti-tank guided weapons teams. The same tactics that the Ukrainians used effectively against Russian forces early in the war, the Russians are now using those same tactics against the Ukrainians. But it's amplified because the Russians have fixed-wing aircraft. They have an air force. So incredibly difficult situation for the Ukrainians. Now we're seeing the Ukrainians use Storm Shadows and other long-range weapon systems, cruise missiles, rocket systems to attack the rear areas of Russian forces. Now the Russians are talking about where we're going to hit command and control nodes in Kiev and other places. We're going to go after the Ukrainian command and control. Well, I think the Russians are already doing that. So I don't really get that verbiage by the Russian side of the equation. Obviously, I would assume that the Russians have been and are going after leadership targets throughout Ukraine, depending on the type of leadership targets they are focusing on. So again, as we hear about these Ukrainians moving in and taking these towns, I would caution the viewer to understand, again, these are fast-moving, small units that are moving in, and they're not consolidating their hold on territory. And we've definitely seen a pause on large-scale maneuver operations by the Ukrainians designed to penetrate Russian lines and then ultimately move towards key targets such as Melitopol, Tokmak. Further to the north, the Ukrainians are nowhere near any sort of strategic victory where they can say they've secured Tokmak or they're threatening Melitopol down here, which would be the ultimate prize, and then finally Berdyansk down here towards the coast as well. That was a key Ukrainian objective, and unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they are not meeting those objectives, and it's proving to be incredibly difficult for Ukrainian offensive operations to be successful. Yes, we are seeing a limited success in terms of the perception of Ukrainian victory, which is being talked about on mainstream media. Hey, they seized 7 towns and kilometers of land. But the reality is, again, these are just small units moving in, raising flags, and then they get the hell out of there because they're getting shelled and attacked by these Russian forces. So it's highly speculative if these areas are currently occupied by actual Ukrainian forces. They have a tough nut to crack in this triple layers of Russian defensive lines that they face to the south. And it's an equation right now that they may not be able to overcome, especially without an air force. And we've talked about this before. It's really a no-win situation for the Ukrainians at this point without an air force. Now, is that to say that that changes in the future with the possibility of the West directly supporting the Ukrainians by handing them over an air force at some point? Obviously, it's going to be a very long process, and in all probability would lead to escalation and a greater, wider-ranging conflict. And I wouldn't completely eliminate the issue with the Storm Shadow that is being used by the British. I mean, there's certain things that the British have to do to allow the Ukrainians even to use those systems, and the British are, for all intents and purposes, active participants in this war by delivering the Storm Shadow. Again, very advanced weapon systems that's being used by the Ukrainians that have been handed over by the British, that I think the Russians are looking very close at in terms of that British participation. Now, will we see an overt strike against the United Kingdom? Probably not. But it would not surprise me if down the road we see something occur, a target of British interest is attacked, destroyed by a third party, or something happens to a British United Kingdom interest piece. So we'll continue to watch this very closely and continue to report. Thank you for joining us today. More to come. Have a good day.